Apparently there's a power outage at school.
Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay, all right. My computer died on me last night, so I'm having some difficulties with computing today. All right, and I'm very glary for whatever reason. I think there's actually sunlight coming in the room today. So, all right. I noticed that most of you have, not all of you, but a good number of you have re-uploaded your GMO report. I don't know why it wasn't allowing you to resubmit, but hopefully the new version, they were both set to allow you to resubmit. But for whatever reason, the first version wasn't. So anyway, I looked at them on the Turnitin link. It allows you as a faculty member to look at them, and I just looked briefly at the similarity scores, and when I saw some of them that were very high, I went and opened a couple of those and noticed that it was not going to go well for some people to have them submitted as such. And quite frankly, the last thing that I want to be doing this weekend is writing up honor code violations on people, because it's just one of the least pleasant aspects of my job. So rather than doing that, I decided to just tell you what the deal was and basically avoid that as much as possible. So anyway, hopefully you appreciate that. I realize it probably made some of you go back and do some work on an assignment that you thought you had already finished, but one of the points of using Turnitin, and I pointed this out in an email to you, is so that you can see what your similarity score is, and if it's overly high, that should put red flags up in front of you, and you should go and revisit your paper. When you click on it, it shows you what parts of your paper are problematic, and so it's a very good tool in terms of avoiding plagiarism. But in my Bio 133 class, just yesterday afternoon, actually, we were dealing with a plagiarism issue. And when I went through the paper myself, looking at it from the standpoint of seeing if it was plagiarized, I actually discovered forms of plagiarism that Turnitin did not detect, because Turnitin is an algorithm. It has a set of rules. It looks for long strings of words, and there are lots of other ways of plagiarizing other than just copying verbatim from original text. So I've made this point to students multiple times in the past that Turnitin is a good first pass, but don't think that it will catch every act of plagiarism, because it is a computer algorithm that is built to detect certain types of plagiarism. Substitution plagiarism, it turns out it's amazingly poor at finding, which is where you take the original text and you basically go in and substitute a bunch of synonyms in the sentence that you've just copied from another source. And that's really easy to detect from a human standpoint, because oftentimes, especially in biology, when you replace biological terms with synonyms that you look up in a thesaurus, you end up getting nonsensical sentences that don't really say what they're supposed to say. And it's very easy for a human to see that. It's very difficult for a machine to see that. So I looked at the submissions this morning, and all of your similarity scores that were problematic have lowered. So hopefully that solves that problem. Anyway, hopefully you appreciated the heads up on that, even though it may have required some extra work on your part. Do you guys have any questions over what we were talking about last time? All right, then let's get to today. So, can you guys see my PowerPoint? Okay, good. So we're in this chapter talking about the ethics of eating meat, and about midway through the chapter, I guess, Michael Pollan starts to talk about the typical protestations of meat eaters. And he has them. One of the nice things about this is that he has his main points kind of highlighted with italicized text, so they're easy to find. And so, you know, he brings up this case of the chimp, and we mentioned it last time. You know, we went through the exercise of kind of thinking about other kinds of organisms and whether or not we would be willing to eat them. And in some cases, you weren't willing to eat them because they were so foreign to you that you couldn't imagine, for example, popping a honeypot ant into your mouth to harvest the sugar that is stored in its abdomen, because that's just such a foreign concept to you. Or eating grubs of palm heart beetles, which are amazingly sweet as well. But then as we got kind of to the middle range of organisms that you're familiar with eating, things like cows and chickens and things like that, pigs, you were pretty comfortable with those things. But then as we got to things that are a little closer to humans, like chimpanzees, you guys then became a little uncomfortable with that because of sort of the moral problems with consuming something that close to us on the evolutionary tree, I assume. So Pollan brings up this idea that to exclude a chimp from our moral consideration simply because he's not human is no different than excluding the slave because he's not white. And he equated this argument to being essentially not really that much different than a racist sort of perspective, and he labeled this as speciesist sort of distinction. And speciesist is not a term that Pollan came up with. This is a term that has existed for quite some time. This idea that human beings, because of their inherent moral superiority, which actually was assigned to human beings by human beings, take this kind of elevated position in nature, which then allows us to decide, in a sense, whether or not other organisms are capable of moral consideration. So one of the counter arguments to this, one of the arguments that a mediator might use as a protestation is, but the differences between blacks and whites are trivial compared to the differences between my son and the chimpanzee. So I want you guys to discuss amongst yourselves. Go ahead and unmute yourselves at will What are your thoughts about kind of the degree of difference between humans and other organisms in terms of whether or not we should include them in our moral consideration?
I really liked when he said he made an equation, I think it was in this chapter, about
Can you guys
it's
hear
not
me?
necessarily yes.
Can you guys hear me?
I can.
Yes.
All right, what's going on? Okay, all right. Okay, so you can hear me. So chat. So talk to me.
I really liked
Sorry, I
when
keep hearing beeps in my headphones, and I'm not sure what my headphones are trying to tell me.
he made the equation that it's not necessarily that like an animal's intelligent, but it's like whether they can suffer or not. Can you hear us?
So I would not kill and consume Blair because he's another human. I wouldn't kill and consume Marcus because he's human also. So at what point, how far away from being like me should I go in order to feel comfortable killing something and eating it?
Dr. Kalinsky, can you hear us?
Blair, if you're saying something, I can't hear you. Hold on a minute.
Blair, are you saying something now?
Not right now, no, but I was. Did everybody else hear my thing about the suffering?
Yeah, I can hear you, Blair.
All right.
Blair, are you still unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, and you're talking.
Right now, yes.
Okay, I can't hear anything through either my headphones or my computer speakers. So I don't know what is going on.
Hey, Blair, just keep talking while I try and figure out what's wrong with my audio.
All right, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, nice. All right, yeah. So what happened is last night my computer just locked up and stopped functioning in the middle of doing work. And so I just shut it down, went to bed. And I guess when I powered it up this morning, it must have reverted to factory settings or something. So it's sending sound through my other monitor through the HDMI cord, which is stupid because my monitor doesn't have speakers on it. It is merely a monitor. So anyway, I can hear you now, which is much less frustrating. Okay. All right, the question on the table. How far away do we have to go from humans before we begin to feel comfortable eating them?
I really liked when he said it's not necessarily an equation of their intelligence if they can suffer or not.
Okay, so that's Peter Singer's view, this idea of suffering. Kenton, you brought up suffering on Wednesday. What was your comment? Remind us of your comment on Wednesday about suffering.
I remember saying a couple things. I remember saying it depends on like how we measure what suffering is, and that there are like multiple qualities to suffering, that it's not just physical pain.
Yeah, so you brought up the plants, that the idea that perhaps plants can suffer just as animals suffer, although they would necessarily have to be in different ways. At that time, I brought up the point that the only way that we can relate to suffering is through the sensory modalities that human beings have, and so we can suffer by just experiencing physical pain because we have nervous systems. And plants don't have nervous systems, so presumably they don't experience physical pain, or if they do, they don't experience it in the way that we do. But of course, physical pain, that's kind of on the extreme end of suffering. There are certainly other ways of suffering. What would be some other ways of suffering?
So I know that, and this may be physical pain, but I know there's that whole thing that if you like scare a deer before it dies, its body like pumps it full of chemicals, or like it gets
Oh,
scared.
oh yeah. So organisms can get scared, certainly. We trimmed my cat's toenails yesterday. We have a cat. Her name is Misty. I was going to use her yesterday, but she wouldn't come out of sleeping wherever she was sleeping. Or I was going to use her as an example on Wednesday, but she was busy sleeping somewhere not very close. And when we are trimming her toenails, you would think that we have her pinned down to the chair and are about to sacrifice her to the gods and then eat her flesh, to hear the way she protests to having her nails trimmed. So certainly animals can experience fear, and one would guess that experiencing that emotion is certainly a form of suffering. You guys are feeling stress at this time of the semester, probably, and stress is generally regarded as your body's fight or flight mechanism kicking in when you are feeling, stress. Your body responds to stress the same way that your body would respond to fear, and you either are going to flee or you're going to stand and fight, and both of those actions require a flood of a hormone through your bloodstream, adrenaline, that gears your body up either to perform physiologically in the act of fleeing or to perform physiologically in the act of fighting. But when you're stressed because you have an exam coming up or because you have an ecology of food paper that has a high similarity rating on Turnitin, you don't get to fight or flee. You just get to sit there at your computer and take it. And so your body is gearing you up for something physiological that there is no physiological response to. It's a mental response in many cases. And so that's why stress is bad for humans. We are in this constant fight or flight mode, and we're not fighting or flighting. And so that's another form of stress. What other forms of stress can you think about? Or forms of suffering can you think about?
I know we talked about last time how like Joel Salatin would define suffering as like when an animal can't do what like instinctively wants to do.
Okay, so Salatin would go even further and say, well, suffering goes beyond just pain and stress. The suffering can extend to whether or not an organism is allowed to live the life that it had kind of evolved to live. And for cattle, that means grazing on grass and not being pinned in a concentrated animal feeding operation, being fed grain. And when that grain messes with the cow's digestive tract and makes them sick, you basically fix that with steroids and antibiotics and things like this. He would say that that is suffering because you're denying that animal its opportunity to live out the life that it would normally have had humans not intervened and domesticated that animal. Other forms of suffering. What are some other forms of suffering? You guys ever go to the zoo? Raise your hand if you've been to the zoo. I've never used polling, but let's try this. I just sent you guys a poll. Answer it, please. Okay. Where's the rest of you? Oh, there we go. Oh, so you guys are about 50-50 split on finding zoos depressing. Quite frankly, I sometimes find zoos depressing. I pretty often find zoos depressing. Why would I find a zoo depressing?
Most of the time, it's not their natural habitat.
So it's not their natural habitat. So they're in spaces much smaller than they would normally occupy out in nature. What else would I maybe find depressing, or could anybody find depressing about a zoo?
They're very busy for the animals.
How do you mean? What do you mean by that, Branson?
There's a lot of people just staring at them while they're in a cage.
Yeah, there are a lot of people there, and so that might cause an animal stress. What other things might one find depressing about zoos? Somebody other than Branson.
We're kind of just manipulating animals' lives for our entertainment.
So one way of viewing a zoo is certainly to think of it as manipulating animals' lives for our own entertainment. One of the things that I actually find not depressing about zoos is that all zoos have a conservation function. And so oftentimes the organisms that you see in zoos are in zoos because they would not survive out in nature because humans are either hunting them to extinction or destroying their habitat, causing them to move towards extinction, or a combination of both of those things, which places them at some level of endangerment. And through agreements among zoos, they actually have breeding systems by which they track individuals and arrange captive breeding programs to essentially maintain the organisms in a captive state until hopefully humans kind of become better humans and create a world where they could actually go back and live in the wild without being hunted to extinction or have their habitat so destroyed that they can't really survive in the wild. They keep what they call stud books on animals so that they know which animals in zoos are related so that they can avoid inbreeding. And so the conservation function of zoos is very important, and I find that uplifting. But oftentimes I find the lives of animals in zoos not as fun as I would like. Now, zoos are way better than they were when I was a child from that standpoint. What other things might you find depressing about zoos?
I would say it takes away an animal's natural ability to like hunt and get food because they're just being basically fed by either hand or buckets.
Yeah, so this goes back to something that Branson mentioned also, is the fact that you have a tiger in a zoo and you're feeding it big slabs of dead meat, when what a tiger would really probably prefer doing is engaging in the act of hunting. That's kind of what it evolved to do. This gets back to Salatin's idea of one form of suffering is not being able to do the things that you kind of have evolved to do. We'll get back to that later again. So I find primate exhibits at zoos to be the most depressing, and primate exhibits now are much better than they were when I was a child, in that they maintain group structure, and so seldom do you see primates isolated and alone anymore. But that was pretty common when I was a child. You see them existing as clans, and sometimes this causes problems for zookeepers, in that, for example, a clan of chimpanzees, there are always going to be struggles for who is the leader of that clan, and that can sometimes lead to animals misbehaving in a way. But what they're basically doing is they're fighting for dominance of the clan, which is something that they would do out in nature. And so having them arranged in social structures is better for the animals, even though at times that causes problems for zoo staff. You'll notice that in primate enclosures, there are many more things in the enclosures to engage them mentally than there were 30 or 40 years ago. And so, another form of suffering that you might say is, in this way of thinking of animals, is having an evolved sort of way of being, not giving them the mental and emotional stimulation that they would normally get in their natural surroundings. Cattle are herd animals, and we usually generally keep cattle in herding sorts of situations. Chickens, on the other hand, in nature are solitary animals for the most part, and so when we keep them in captivity in flocks, that's not necessarily how they would be behaving out in nature. Pigs, once again, are generally on the solitary side of things. They will run in packs, but oftentimes those packs are made up of family members, and so they really aren't herding animals the way cattle are. They're mainly familial animals, and once again, this occasionally causes problems in the raising of pigs. In the book, over on page 317, Poland talks about problems that occur in chicken houses when you're raising chickens at high densities. Chickens begin to misbehave, and one of the things that they do is they will pet one another to death. And this is, once again, an artifact of taking an organism that is normally a solitary jungle creature out in nature, in the wild, and pinning it together with tens or hundreds or thousands of its conspecifics, and they tend to then exhibit a lot of the kinds of behaviors that we see when we, for example, keep rats at too high densities. Rats will kill one another above above a certain density.
I heard, and I don't know the validity behind this. It was just on like a little video I saw that there was something called the mice utopia experiment.
I'm not aware of the mice utopia experiment.
I need to look into it, but apparently it was a thing where somebody gave, it was either mice or rats, a like perfect environment where there was no disease, infinite food, and like just like all around infinite conditions. And the rats actually became violent.
Became what?
Violent towards one another.
Oh, I'm not aware of that experiment. Sounds weird, but
I don't know if it's true or not, but I just saw it and thought it was relevant.
so we still haven't gotten to the question, to an answer to the question of kind of how far away from ourselves do we go before we're comfortable eating something. For you guys, humans were definitely out. Chimps were out. What about orangutans, lemurs, all different primate species, but once again, further and further away from humans in terms of appearances and behavior and things like this. Do you guys know what a oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting the name of it because I'm blanking. Pangolins. You guys know what pangolins are? If you don't know what a pangolin, go look up a pangolin on your computer. You guys are all on your computer at the moment. These are pangolins. Quite frankly, I think they're cute as can be. There's a stuffed example of one in our apartment. It's in Dr. Reynolds' office. Oh, there's a pangolin with a cute little pangolin baby. This is one of the most trafficked animals in the world. It's definitely a huge part of the bushmeat mixture in Southern Africa and Asia, and people eat these regularly to the point that they also are at risk of extinction from things like overhunting. So obviously, a lot of humans don't have problems eating pangolins, even though I think they're kind of cute. How far do we have to go away from being human before it's okay for us to kill and eat it? No judgment here. I'm just curious as to what you think.
I think that it's immediately away from being human.
What's that?
I think it's as soon as it's not human.
So you would be okay with chimps. So you weren't here on Wednesday, but I pulled the class on eating chimpanzees, and nobody was willing to eat a chimpanzee.
So the thing I don't like a lot about the whole can we eat certain animals like argument and the whole conversation is it locks us into being superior beings because we have like complex train of thought when you get down to it, we are also animals that need to eat. We are also part of the circle of life. And so there's, to me, what that means is that the way that other animals don't think about whether it's okay to eat an animal. And
yes, they're just doing what they're doing.
Yeah. And so now would I eat a chimpanzee? I don't think so. I think that my conditioned behavior growing up there would be something there to keep me from eating a chimpanzee. But the more I think about it, the more it's like, well, why are we sacrificing our self-sustaining behavior just because we can recognize it? We still have a responsibility to keep humans alive.
And so it has always struck me as I read this book semester after semester that Poland, in his own language, refers to humans and animals, but he never talks about humans and other animals. So even in Poland's own mind, he sets humans somewhat apart. But the fact of the matter is, humans are animals. We're just as animal as a chimpanzee, as a penguin, as an insect. And so I find it interesting that in his attempts to unpack this, he reveals his own kind of speciesist view because he doesn't really refer to humans very often as animals. He always is contrasting humans with animals. And so you're right, Blair. We do have a biological imperative ourselves to eat things. But the question isn't whether or not we have a biological imperative to eat things. The question is, do we have a biological imperative to eat meat? Is I guess kind of the point.
And I mean, like, I would say yes, because just because we can sustain ourselves completely vegetarian, our digestive systems and our mouths, like specifically the way our teeth are structured, are meant for eating plants and meat. And so taking morality out of the question, I'd say that we are predisposed to eating both.
We are, by definition, omnivores. That's kind of the whole point of this thing.
And so the only reason that we wouldn't eat meat is because we feel bad.
Okay, so remember Blair's comments as we kind of work our way through this whole thing, because we're actually going to revisit this, and I have a lot of typos in this PowerPoint for some reason. So why should we treat animals any more ethically than they treat one another? This is one of the protestations that meat eaters will trot out. Well, animals are out there telling one another, why should we not kill them and eat them? What does Poland say, or what do you think about this particular argument? What are problems with this particular argument? This is something that critically thinking dual students should be good at, finding holes in other people's arguments.
Could you say that we don't need to hurt them to, I guess, survive in a way?
Okay, so one argument might be that even though organisms out in nature, animals out in nature will hunt and kill one another, there's no absolute need for us to behave that way. And so to extend kind of the natural behavior of other organisms and impose that on ourselves might not be a reasonable thing to do. If we took this view to apply to us, in reality, would we want to live in a society where we're subject to nothing more than the laws of nature? This is actually a point that Poland brings up. The they do it too argument, the animal rightist has a simple devastating reply. To the they do it too argument, the animal rightist has a simple devastating reply. Do you really want to base your moral code on the natural order? Murder and rape are natural too. Besides, we can choose. Humans don't need to kill other creatures in order to survive. Carnivorous animals do. Though if my cat Otis is any guide, animals sometimes kill for the sheer pleasure of it. And that's actually true also. There are animals, there's a whole field of study in animal behavior that is referred to as, and why is my brain not functioning today? Oh, it's like something along the lines of wasteful killing, when organisms out in nature will kill something and in the end they don't So do you really want to, do you want us as humans to behave as if we're governed by nothing more than the laws of nature? To quote a 19th century naturalist, nature red in tooth and claw. So you guys are okay with that kind of society? The strong prevail, the weak gets taken advantage of. Are you thinking, or are you just refusing to engage?
I could be wrong.
Well, no, there's nothing. This is one of those situations where there really aren't any wrong answers. I'm trying to get us to the point where we can think about better answers through the process of talking about the issues. So just go for it.
No, yeah, I'm saying I could be wrong, but I would say that we do live by natural order.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, outside, like, if you just took a look at our society, it's just a more complex version of what monkeys on certain islands are doing, using tools and creating these systems in which it's easier for us to survive. We created, you could say that we created like the rules of morality in terms of like don't murder and don't do all that because of religion, but it's also so that it makes us easier to survive. It's a really complex system of it rather than like the simple hierarchies that animals will have. But I would say that it's still a natural order. Just because we live in a concrete jungle doesn't necessarily mean it's not nature.
Yeah.
I've
Go ahead, Ken.
I've read a lot of literature that would suggest that trying to base our moral systems in the appeal to extending life, prolongating life, is actually anti-Black, because these moral systems tend to construct themselves in terms of dichotomies of human and non-human, which equate themselves to dichotomies like citizen, non-citizen, which further equate themselves to dichotomies like white and Black, wherein morality is always excluded for the white subject, and humanness itself is seen as belonging to whiteness. Therefore, these moral systems literally construct a apparatus of sight wherein we see Blackness as amoral and disposable.
Well, and certainly, I mean, if you look at the way we use language, the things that you talk about, kind of how we categorize light and darkness, black and white, things like this, it's kind of embedded in our language to the degree that it's really kind of hard to avoid when you're just, having a conversation with someone. I would argue that it extends beyond just, white and colored to essentially power versus powerless. And it just so happens in our culture that the power resides in the white people for the most part, and colored people generally have power stripped from them. If you went to another culture, you might not see that particular dichotomy, simply because there are no white people, or white people are the vast minority. So we do have. So I would argue that both of you are hitting on important points. We do have a natural order. There is a natural pecking order among humans. All you have to do is look around the United States in the year 2020 and realize that power accrues to certain people and it doesn't accrue to other people. And simply because it's playing out not in terms of what we eat. We don't have rich people eating poor people, but still those power differences certainly do exist. So you might argue that we're actually not that much different than the other animals in the world. It's just that the way that plays out in human cultures and human societies is not in terms of consuming one another, but in other kind of power dynamics. Another protestation of meat eaters. Wouldn't life be worse for these animals if they were out in nature?
I mean, I think to a certain degree, but I think it's also because we have this desire to keep things. I think if it's an animal's natural order to go extinct, then it should happen.
So extinction is certainly a thing that happens. It has happened as long as there have been organisms. Organisms have been going extinct. As a conservation-minded biologist, I would probably say that humans are driving species to extinction at much faster rates than background levels of extinction would indicate. We're in what some ecologists refer to as the sixth major extinction, and this is actually the first global extinction event that is driven by interspecies interactions rather than some abiotic factor influencing the extinction rate. Would life in the wild be worse for these creatures? Blair says, yes, probably. Anyone else want to chime in? Blake, you have been silent all day.
Well, I'm just curious if you're wondering like animals that are in a zoo now or animals that are like cows that are just kept on a farm
Well, we're actually talking about food, so I'm thinking about cows and sheep and pigs and chickens.
I definitely think it's a lot easier now. I mean, they obviously don't live that long, but I mean, they're fed food and kept until they're eventually killed.
So when you think about a concentrated animal feeding operation, though, are those conditions that you would want to hang out in?
Probably not.
Okay, so if you wouldn't want to hang out in them, do you think it doesn't matter that cows hang out there because they're just cows?
I guess I don't really think about it like that, but yeah, I mean, if I was a cow, I wouldn't want to be kept inside of a little area or enclosed area.
But they're cows. They're basically on the face of the earth so that we can eat them.
Yeah.
So there is a way in which you can think of it that way as well.
I mean, I guess since we aren't cows, I mean, then they're just cows to us and we shouldn't really care about them. But if I was a cow, then I wouldn't want to be kept like that.
Yeah, I might not want to be kept like that either if I was a cow. There was a number of years ago, I was teaching a different class at Williamsville College, and one of the students had heard the story about the fact that the Missouri Department of Conservation had hired professional hunters to go out to Kansas City International Airport and cull the deer herd that was living around the airport. And the reason that they were having to do this is because the deer population had gotten so large that they were beginning to cause problems at the airport because there were literally like herds of deer walking out onto the runway while jet airplanes were trying to take off and land. And if you fly into a deer as you're landing at a couple of 100 miles per hour, it's going to rip the landing gear off of your plane. The plane will crash, onto the tarmac, and it'll just be bad. And this student was all up in arms about these hunters out at Kansas City International Airport essentially killing Bambi. And I guess I kind of went on a rant because I said, okay, so what's more humane? A deer on the tarmac getting shot by a hunter, or us basically fixing the world that we've kind of messed up and taking things back to their natural state. When, if you think about Missouri 200 years ago, there were deer here and there were elk here, and there were things like packs of wolves roaming the landscape, killing and eating those deer. And the reason that we have the deer problem now is because we don't have the predators that used to feed on these deer. And so one of the experiments that is kind of a natural experiment that's happened in Yellowstone National Park has been the reintroduction of wolves, and how the reintroduction of wolves has affected the population sizes of all these other organisms, not because they've killed and eaten a lot of them, but they've actually changed the behavior of those organisms. And so I asked the students, do any of you guys know how a wolf pack hunts down a prey item? And of course, none of them knew that. But do you guys know how a wolf pack hunts?
Don't they wear it out?
Oh, they wear it out. They do kind of like what bicyclists do. They run in a pack, and they'll send the freshest wolf up to the front, and he or she drives the deer forward at a fast pace. And then when that animal starts to tire out, they'll send up a fresher wolf, and then when that one tires up, they'll send up a fresher wolf until they've basically run the animal to exhaustion. And at that point, what do?
Kill it.
They will surround it, and they will start to begin to snipe at it. They will go in and take little nicks on it, basically once again wearing it down as it spins around trying to defend itself. And ultimately they'll bring down the deer, and they will start to feed on it. And they may kill it before they start to feed on it, but they may not. And my question to the student after this little rant was, what is more humane? Shooting the deer with a bullet where it goes down immediately, or having it be chased around by wolves for hours and hours, and then finally caught and eaten, maybe alive, maybe not alive. At this point, the student was a little gray in the face, and I thought maybe I've overstepped my bounds as a professor. So back to Blake's point, in some ways, life in nature is harsh and cruel. And one might argue that animals in captivity are actually better off than they would be in the wild. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, but an argument could be made along those lines. I would love to see, by the way, wolf packs back in Missouri. But it's never going to happen. We're too agrarian a society right now for that to happen. Another protestation of meat eaters. Without us eating them, they wouldn't exist at all. You guys have some knowledge that you can apply to this particular protestation.
You're talking about like corn?
No, I'm about corn, you said? Yeah, well, we're talking about meat, so we're not talking about plants at this point. So the argument is without us eating them, cows wouldn't exist at all. Without us eating them, chickens wouldn't exist at all. Without us eating them, pigs wouldn't exist. But they've become domesticated animals because we domesticated them, and now that they're domesticated, they wouldn't be able to survive out in nature, so they wouldn't even exist if we were not continuing to propagate them. This is one of the easiest protestations and mediators to take down because we've actually talked about this in class. What's the problem with this particular argument? Mary, you have been silent today for the most part.
Well, if we hadn't domesticated them in the first place, they would still be living a life in the wild, in which case they would have either gone extinct naturally or be living just fine.
Yeah, so in all of these cases, we've studied what the wild progenitors are of each of these species that we use as domesticated animals. Jungle fowl are still found in the jungles of Southeast Asia. I have seen them in the jungles of Southeast Asia with my own eyes. Bos primigenius would have evolved over time, but it would still be some form of wild cattle. Pigs still live in the wild. There are wild boars that in some cases are actual wild boars that have never been domesticated. And there are also wild boars that have escaped domestication and kind of reverted back over a series of generations into looking very much like the wild progenitors from which the domesticated stocks were taken. So in all these cases, these organisms that we view now primarily as domesticated organisms have wild progenitors that if humans hadn't come along and domesticated them would have been exactly in the states that Mary refers to. They would have either eventually gone extinct through hunting pressure and things like this, or they wouldn't have gone extinct and we would treat them as any other wild animal out in the world. For all we know, they might actually be in zoos. Oh, guess what? Many of these domesticated animals are in zoos, in petting zoos, inside of regular zoos. If you go down to the Kansas City Zoo, they have actually a barnyard exhibit where you can go in and interact with domesticated animals. So the idea that without us eating them, they wouldn't exist at all, that's just the stupidest argument I've ever heard. Oh, I'm sorry, I was very judgmental about that particular argument. Animals on factory farms have never known any other life. So why should we be concerned about them? This is kind of what they've been bred for.
That just sounds like very logically similar to slaves on the plantation haven't known any other life, which is really paternalistic and problematic logic.
So it's problematic logic from that standpoint. What else is problematic with this particular argument? Think about steer 534. From last time. Michael Pullen bought a steer 534, is tracking it through the food chain.
I mean, didn't they graze in like the first 2 weeks?
Yeah, the first 6 months. First 6 months of every cow's life is spent on grass for the most part. So the idea that they've never known any other life is just ridiculous because cattle in particular have known a different life. Pigs and chickens, it's a little more, this statement is a little more true, but for cows, it's just patently not in keeping with what we know of the reality of how we raise cattle. But the world is full of problems, and surely solving human problems must come first. This gets back to some things that were mentioned earlier today. Kenton, you must have something to say about this.
I mean, anytime the category of human gets invoked, I go back to the same basic problematic I was like
That you just
explaining in
stated.
terms of general
Yeah.
ethics earlier. Yeah, just like as soon as we construct the category of the human, this category makes sense only if it is judicially imposed against some existential possibilities which are considered non-ontological. In our racialized society, that ends up being the criminalization of Black behavior and queer behavior, so that like the paradigm of the cishet white man is able to be preserved alongside the notion of humanness.
Unfortunately, though, we're not eating gays and blacks. We're eating chickens and cows. But I see your point. Anytime we set up this categorization, it's humans versus other, and whether you're talking about Black people who used to be considered non-human back in the day, or whether you're talking about pigs and chickens and cows. Once again, this idea that humans are other and somehow superior, then that sets us apart, and we basically should be able to do whatever we want in a sense. And so it's pretty easy to justify eating other organisms when you take this particular approach. I hadn't thought about this in terms of our current political environment, but this whole idea of America first just really speaks to me when I think about this particular statement from Poland's book. This idea that there's all these groupings, us and others, humans and others, et cetera, et cetera. It gets to Kenton's point starkly, but once again, I guess that I have lots of problems with this way of thinking as well, just from the standpoint of what Kenton is getting at. We're out of time. Hopefully, we'll finish up talking about the ethics of eating meat. All of these points that are in this PowerPoint are highlighted in Poland's book, and we're just going to continue marching through the last few of them. So if you haven't read this section of Poland's book yet, then by all means read it for Monday. We will finish this on Monday and move on to thinking about food inequality in the Kansas City region on Monday. So come prepared for that. If you haven't logged on to the Mapping Inequality website, definitely do that by Monday. And I will see you guys on Monday. You don't have any papers hanging over your head for this class, so try and relax a little bit over the weekend.